But it's very clear from this distribution over here that we might want to reconsider what kind of place the United States is. So just to remind you now, the Michiganders rated very high on all of the status scales. They were above 3.5 on all scales. And they were especially high on no drawl and no twang. That's obviously no such thing going on in Michigan, but they were also very high for normal, smart, and good English. The South, of course, rated very, very low for all of those scores. But the South was higher, and in fact statistically higher than the North for casual, friendly, down-to-earth, and polite, all of which I take, although I may be confused, to be positive values. Could it simply be the case that Northerners like Southern English better than their own English when looked at by this more sensitive scale? I think so. I think the United States is no longer a B-type place, and maybe it never was. Maybe I've just beaten it over the head by asking people what's good and what's bad. And with this more sensitive measure, I suggest the United States might be a D-type place. If smart aleck Northerners who are LV1 speakers do indeed know that they have the status, and us poor old beleaguered Southerners, yes, sure, we give them that status. But when it comes to solidarity, it seems to me that more and more better educated speakers, Northern speakers and others, are feeling a little funny about the degree of friendliness and solidarity which their own speech might give to them, and they turn to others. We've seen this in things like studies of crossing among teenagers who look to prejudice against ethnic groups and pick up pieces of their speech and sometimes great chunks of their speech to form a kind of solidarity with them which they don't really want. It's some other kind of solidarity. It's the one which means I'm the down-to-earth person who can express friendliness, casualness, and so forth. So yes, the North still does need the South so that it will know that it is a correct place. That's just like I said before. But it also seems that the North needs the South so that it can satisfy both of the great urges of American linguistic life, maybe both of the great urges of life in general. We have a national mania for correctness, but I think we should add to this a national mania for solidarity. So you take a poor old intellectual like Bill Clinton, hell, he could have never been elected to public office unless he had combined it with some strong populist appeal. But a populist like George Bush would have never been elected if he hadn't reassured us during his campaign that he was going to bring a lot of very clever people along who would advise him. Why in the hell would language be any different? It isn't any different. With the North, the country can simply reassure itself that it has the intellectual ammunition to take on the modern world. But with the South, it can also reassure itself that it is not all scratch and claw, as one of my respondents wrote on his map, but also warm, down-to-earth, and courteous. Thank you.
Are there questions? We have about 5 minutes for questions after this one. Comments?
How do you know when you ask people if language is courteous, warm, and down to earth, that they're reacting to linguistic variables and not just the sort of general social impressions of the South?
Because we told them to pay attention to language. So that's the simple answer. The complex answer, of course, is do we believe that linguistic stereotypes are always mediated by typical or stereotypical speakers from that region? Now, we know from studies a long, long time ago that in some cases, some linguistic elements actually seem to step out of that, right? So an old study by Leslie Mulroy showed, for example, that the same kind of ratings were given to some dialects even when the respondents couldn't identify the dialect properly. Now, or correctly, rather. Now, I of course, escaped from that by not letting them listen to dialects and simply asked them to rate the speech regions of the country on the basis of the speech imagination that they've got in their mind. But I do ask them to do this on the basis of language. That is, we don't just say, what do you think of this part of the country, but we say, what do you think of the speech of this part of the country? It's also possible, of course, that you can imagine that people don't have any idea how people sound in that part of the country. And my friend Bill LaVoff a long time ago pointed out to me once that when I was doing some of these studies that I had forgotten to ask people if they had ever visited a place before or not. So sure enough, the next time I went back and did it, I said, please mark, on your response, not only a scale of correctness, but whether you went to that place or not. Went back, did the statistics. There was no difference on any area or state ever rated based on whether or not a person had been there or not. So personal acquaintance with varieties just didn't have anything to do with this. So I appreciate this concern, because I'm pretty sure that lurking behind these ratings are a large number of social and regional stereotypes and so forth. In fact, I think another thing that I'm going to talk about later, not here, but when I can write the paper, is the sort of changing stereotype of the South that's happened over the last 50 years in the North, where the an older South that had to do with some magnolia tree and mint julep and crinoline kind of stereotypes has completely disappeared to an upland South. When you ask Northerners to imitate Southern speech now, they don't sound like Rhett Butler. They all sound like the Dukes of Hazzard and the Beverly Hillbillies. So there's been a considerable change in what the picture of the South is. So that old plantation South view is an almost disappeared caricature in the North. But you're right, Ron. I mean, it's obviously filtered through these things. And that's why we're turning in some other research to using specific pieces, specific linguistic chunks to get at these attitudinal formulations. Sorry for a long answer. That Courtney?
Just along the same lines, I wondered if you think that it could be the fact that, I don't know when you started this, but I think in your earlier papers on the same topic, people still maybe had in mind George Wallace and people like that from the South. Whereas in the last, certainly 10 years, whether you like them or not, we've had Bill Clinton. Well, actually, going back, we've had Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and now Bush. And I wonder if the idea of power is added to this.
I'd like to believe that there's been a kind of amelioration because people who, whether you like them or not, apparently have gained high office and must have some modicum of intelligence in one direction or another, might, give the lie to the fact that we're just a bunch of barefoot moonshiners who marry our cousins. But when we look, I've got a student who's just finished a piece of research on asking something that Ron might not approve of. Goes, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear somebody speak like you do, as a Michigander? And what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear somebody speak like a Southerner? And I tell you, that second list does not look like any of the values that you would want to associate with Jimmy Carter. That's a pretty ugly list. Although interestingly, and I wanted to give you some of this, but I can't really just have time to finish the work. The list of stuff of people who sounds like we do was not a Northern list at all. It was stuff that sounded like a hip young person. And immediate post-ad. That's what the North sounds like. And all the Southern stuff, a bunch of old guys. So there's other obvious person stereotypes going on here.
Okay, thanks, Dan. That was great.